Private Lena Voss stood 5'2" in combat boots, and every man in her battalion knew it before she had said a single word. She arrived at the forward training base on a cold morning in early spring, when the grass was still stiff with frost, and the wind carried the smell of diesel and wet canvas. She had transferred in from a small marksmanship program most of the veteran soldiers had never even heard of, a program tucked away in the mountains where recruits trained in silence and snow. Nobody had told the battalion much about her. All they saw was a slight young woman stepping off the transport truck with a duffel bag nearly as tall as she was, her uniform pressed, her face calm. The barracks buzzed with the usual jokes before she had even set her bag down. "They sent us a kid," someone muttered. "Does the rifle weigh more than she does?" another voice called out, followed by laughter that rolled down the hall like a wave. Lena said nothing. She had heard worse, and she had learned long ago that arguing with laughter only fed it. She found her bunk, unpacked her gear with quiet, practiced movements, and spent the evening cleaning her rifle by lamplight, while the other soldiers played cards and traded stories 2 bunks away. She listened to their voices without joining in, not because she disliked them, but because she was saving her energy for the only place where words did not matter, the range. At 0500 the next morning, she was standing in formation before anyone else, her boots laced tight, her breath fogging in the cold air. Nobody had told her to arrive early. She just did. Her drill sergeant, a broad-shouldered veteran named Holt, had spent 2 decades training marksmen and had seen every kind of recruit walk through his gates. The overconfident ones who washed out in a week, the quiet ones who surprised everyone, and the ones who simply blended into the background and were forgotten. For the first week, he watched Lena without comment, the way a man studies weather before deciding whether to trust it. She was quiet, yes. She listened more than she spoke, yes. But on the range, something was different about her. While other recruits fired and adjusted, Lena would kneel for a long moment before her first shot, reading the wind drift off the grass the way a sailor reads the sea. Her breathing would slow to almost nothing in the half-second before she pulled the trigger, and her shots landed with a consistency that made even the instructors pause. Still, the mockery did not stop. If anything, her quiet skill seemed to annoy some of the louder recruits more than her size ever had. There was a sergeant named Draven, popular among the younger soldiers, quick with a joke and quicker with a grin that made people laugh even when the joke wasn't very funny. He was talented, everyone agreed on that, and he knew it. He made it something of a habit to needle Lena whenever the group gathered on the range, tossing comments over his shoulder like they cost him nothing. "Too small for this kind of work," he would say, adjusting his own rifle with practiced ease. "That rifle's gonna knock you flat one of these days." The men around him would laugh, some out of genuine amusement, others simply because laughing along was easier than staying silent. Lena would glance at him, say nothing, and keep shooting. Her targets, more often than not, told a different story than his jokes did, but somehow that never seemed to matter in the moment. Reputation, she was learning, moved faster than truth. Weeks passed this way. Training grew harder. The days grew longer, filled with drills, marches, and the kind of exhaustion that wore down even the most confident recruits. Lena kept her head down and her rifle clean. She wrote no complaints, filed no requests for reassignment, and never once asked Sergeant Draven to stop. She simply worked, morning after morning, as if proving herself to anyone but the target in front of her was beneath her attention. Sergeant Holt noticed this too. He noticed how she never flinched when the laughter came, how her hands never shook even when her cheeks flushed red with the sting of being mocked in front of dozens of people. He began to understand that her silence was not weakness. It was discipline, the kind that could not be taught in a single season, the kind that came from somewhere deep and private that she had no interest in explaining to anyone. Then, in the final weeks of the training cycle, word came down from command that a joint training exercise had been scheduled, larger than anything the base had hosted in years. Officers from several Allied units would be visiting to observe the training program, and the base commander wanted something memorable to show them, a demonstration that would prove the program's marksmen were among the best being produced anywhere. The commander decided on a live shooting demonstration to be held at dawn, in front of a full assembly of troops. Nearly 3,000 soldiers would gather on the parade ground to watch. The news spread through the barracks within hours, carried on excited whispers and nervous energy. For most recruits, it was simply exciting, a break from the usual routine, a chance to see something impressive happen. For the marksmen selected to participate, it was something closer to both an honor and a burden. To perform in front of 3,000 pairs of eyes, with visiting officers watching closely, was not something anyone treated lightly. The target chosen for the demonstration was a steel plate, no wider than a dinner plate, set at a distance considered difficult, even for experienced marksmen under calm conditions. The base commander wanted a real test, not a showpiece designed to make things look easier than they were. Complicating matters further, the weather forecast for the morning promised a steady crosswind, the kind that could easily pull a shot wide if a shooter misjudged it even slightly. Sergeant Draven was among those selected to participate, and he made sure everyone knew it, walking through the barracks with an extra measure of swagger in the days leading up to the event. Lena's name was not initially on the list. Whether this was oversight, hesitation, or simple habit, nobody said. She did not ask to be added. She continued her mornings exactly as she always had, rising before the others, checking her rifle, walking the range alone, before the sun was fully up. The morning of the demonstration arrived cold and clear, the sky just beginning to lighten at the edges when the soldiers began filing onto the parade ground. 3,000 men and women stood in formation, rows stretching further than the eye could easily follow, their breath rising in pale clouds above them. Officers from visiting units stood near the base commander at the front, notebooks in hand, expressions carefully neutral in the way that people practiced for observing others. The wind picked up just as the sun broke the horizon, catching the dry grass at the edge of the field and bending it in slow waves. Draven stepped up first, confident as always, drawing a few scattered cheers from the soldiers who knew him. He settled into position, checked his sight, and fired. The shot missed, low and pulled wide by the crosswind he had misjudged by a fraction. A murmur rippled through the assembled troops, quiet but unmistakable. Draven's jaw tightened. He was not used to missing, especially not in front of a crowd this size, and the sting of it showed plainly on his face even as he tried to shrug it off with a small, forced laugh. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then, perhaps out of frustration, perhaps out of some instinct he did not fully understand himself, Draven turned toward the ranks behind him and called out, half as a joke, half as something else entirely. "Let's see the kid try." The words carried further than he probably intended. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd almost instantly, soldiers turning to look for Lena among the rows, officers exchanging quiet glances at the front. It was, in its own strange way, a kind of dare, thrown out carelessly, but impossible to take back once it had left his mouth. Sergeant Holt, standing near the command line, did not move to stop it. He simply nodded once, a small, quiet gesture, as though he had been waiting for exactly this moment, without ever saying so out loud. Lena stepped forward from the ranks. She did not rush, and she did not hesitate either. Her pace was steady, unbothered, the same pace she used every morning walking to the range, while the rest of the base was still asleep. Whispers followed her the entire way, though whether they were curious, doubtful, or something else was impossible to say from her expression, which remained calm as still water. She reached the firing line and knelt, settling into position with the same quiet precision she used every single day, the same routine that had earned her nothing but jokes for months. She checked the wind one last time, watching the grass at the edge of the field bend and settle, her eyes narrowing slightly as she calculated the drift in her mind. The field went silent. 3,000 people, standing shoulder to shoulder, seemed to hold their breath all at once. Even the wind itself seemed to pause for a heartbeat, as though the morning had decided to give her exactly the stillness she needed. Lena exhaled halfway, held her breath, and steadied her hands against the cold metal of her rifle. Every lesson she had ever learned, every quiet morning she had spent alone on the range while others slept, every moment of laughter she had absorbed without response, seemed to gather itself into that single, narrow point of focus. She fired. The steel plate rang out across the parade ground. A clean, unmistakable hit dead center, the sound cutting through the morning air like a bell. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence held, thick and stunned, as though the crowd needed an extra second to fully understand what they had just witnessed. Then it broke all at once. A wave of noise rolling across the parade ground, soldiers cheering, officers murmuring quickly to one another, some already scribbling notes. Somewhere near the edge of the crowd, Draven stood frozen, his earlier bravado replaced by something quieter, something closer to disbelief. Sergeant Holt was the first to reach her, closing the distance in a few long strides, his hand landing firmly on her shoulder. "Told you," he said quietly, though of course he had told no one anything at all, not out loud, not until this very moment. Lena allowed herself a small, private smile, the kind that did not seek an audience, the kind meant only for herself. She did not raise her arms in celebration. She did not turn to search out Draven's reaction or wait for the crowd's applause to grow louder. She simply nodded once, accepted her sergeant's hand on her shoulder, and rose to her feet. By the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the story had already begun spreading through the base, passed from soldier to soldier faster than any official report could have traveled. The small soldier nobody had taken seriously, the one who had been mocked for her size since the day she arrived, had made the one shot none of the others could manage, under conditions that had already humbled a far more confident shooter. Word reached the visiting officers before breakfast was even served. Some asked to meet her personally, curious about the quiet recruit who had turned a routine demonstration into something the entire base would be talking about for weeks. Lena answered their questions politely, briefly, offering no dramatic stories, no bitterness about the months of teasing she had endured. She spoke only about wind patterns and breathing control, about patience and practice, as though the moment on the parade ground had simply been the natural result of showing up early every single morning. Draven approached her later that day, finding her alone near the equipment shed as she cleaned her rifle in the fading afternoon light. He stood awkwardly for a moment, clearly unused to the position he now found himself in. "That was a good shot," he finally said, the words coming out simpler and more honest than anything he had said to her in months. Lena looked up, studying his face for a moment before answering. "Wind was steady," she said simply. Made it easier than it looked. It was not quite an acceptance of his earlier comments, and it was not quite forgiveness either. It was something smaller and more practical than either of those things, an acknowledgement that passed between two soldiers who understood, in that moment, that the range did not care about jokes or size or reputation. It only cared about the shot itself. In the weeks that followed, the teasing did not vanish overnight, though it changed in tone, softened by something that had not existed before, a quiet, grudging respect that no amount of laughter could fully hide. Lena did not ask for apologies, and she did not seek out praise either. She continued rising before dawn, continued cleaning her rifle by lamplight, continued walking the range alone while the rest of the base slept. She never asked to be underestimated. She had simply learned, long before arriving at that base, that being underestimated was often easier to live with than being watched too closely. Until, of course, the moment came when watching closely was exactly what everyone needed to do. She made sure, after that dawn on the parade ground, that it never happened quite the same way again.